Hey fools, I'm Eric Bleeker. Welcome to Tech Weekly. I'm joined here by Jamal Carnett and Simon Erickson from our Rule Breakers team. Jamal, one fantasy football sleeper this year.
Ooh, I'm actually going to go with Peyton. I still think he's a little underrated right
The old Manning. Simon, who you got?
I like the tight ends, Eric. I took Jason Witten last night. I think he's a sleeper. Nobody gives the tight ends any credit, but I think he's going to put some points on the board.
Staying true to Texas.
Staying true to Texas.
I will go with Reggie Bush, especially if you're in a point per reception league. But let's get to technology and what's bigger news, especially right now, than Apple. We've had a bit of a slower week, I would say. Summer doldrums, getting ready to get back into fall, getting ready to see a little more action. But what have you seen in Apple this week? Specifically, we were talking before the show about a possible trade-in program that looks more inevitable than not right now.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of different moving pieces of this, getting more people into Apple retail stores. But I think the story and what's been buried here in the story is what's going to happen with the traded-in phones. Right now, a company called Brightstar is looking to take those phones and actually sell them in emerging markets. I think this is going to help Apple compete on price basis with Google, and I also think it's going to help those emerging markets get into Apple's ecosystem, which, by the way, is the fastest growing segment of Apple's business units.
Sure. Simon, what are you thinking about the past week?
Jamal said it well, very good points, but I think that mainly the bottom line here is driving traffic to the retail stores.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, Tim Cook's goal, right now they're driving about 20% of sales through the retail store experience. Tim Cook wants to move it up to 50%. You can't do that without some kind of game-changing idea. Well, you start offering refunds. That's a good way to drive people into stores. It's a good reason that instead of just that automatic, go to AT&T to get your phone, go to Apple because there's a better experience. That's number one. Number two, was it Brightstar?
I think it's Brightstar.
Yeah, Brightstar reselling through there. One of the big things is people will say, why are you, why would you want to do this, buying these phones, because you're going to cannibalize? Brightstar sells to developing markets. Right. One interesting wrinkle to that, though, would be if there is a cheaper iPhone 5C, you could actually have the older iPhone 4s coming into markets and actually competing there.
That's something that they are going to have to watch out for.
And that'll be an interesting wrinkle, possibly, that we haven't seen in the past. So that's something for investors to watch out for. But I definitely think that this is a good idea. We're always looking at a refresh cycle. It's not that people own smartphones. It's how quickly you're upgrading them. This will move the refresh cycle forward, gets rid of older phones and moves them to markets where they're looking to gain share. And like we said, moves people to their retail store experience. So I feel like this one's virtually guaranteed. And the other thing we saw this week, no iPad mini at the September 10th event. We've been expecting that, so I'm not going to labor too long on that. Let's move to the car, specifically iOS in the car. This isn't something we're seeing a lot of news from recently, but Gotta Be Mobile had actually interviewed, and I need to get his title here because it's a whopper, the Director of Electrical and Electronic Systems at Ford Research and Innovation. Breathe.
Wow.
And
what a business card.
He had, initially Ford wasn't on the presentation for doing iOS in the car. Right. But he had said that's not because they're not looking at it, it's because they couldn't commit to the 2014 launch date. What are you seeing about Apple in the automobile?
Well, it's actually an interesting story here. I'm actually going to take another wrinkle here. I think this is a little more of Microsoft's loss than Apple's gain. The Sync came out many years ago to much fanfare in Ford's cars, and it just wasn't a game changer for either company. Now, what's going on here is it looks like Ford is actually going to, at some point, introduce Apple into the cars. So I like the specialization. I mean, I like back in the day when they had the Bose systems and the Harman Kardon systems in cars, and I think this will work. But I think this is more emblematic of Microsoft's failure to innovate and failure to keep this product, the Sync product, than it is more of Apple actually bringing it in. Apple was introduced to GM and a bunch of other cars in the past, and I think right now Ford's playing catch up.
Yeah, and I think you kind of need to look at in-car entertainment that's a bit siloed off from your key mobile experience. And
Agreed.
iOS in the car is supposed to be an extension. And what we need to remember is, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? Well, to be frank, in-car entertainment systems suck. They're glitchy. They can't easily be upgraded. It's just a terrible experience. And here you have these mobile operating systems that everyone's using, and you can leverage into them. They control your entertainment. They control your contacts. They control your GPS. And you can put those in the car, and you can leverage those better. The key question I have is, we know less than we know, especially about iOS in the car. we don't know what final form it'll even take.
Agreed.
What could be interesting, what if it was a hardware play, essentially an iPad, that went to center console, and you were able to upgrade every 2 or 3 years. Then you could keep the hardware going, because one of the problems with in-car entertainment, once that car is 5 years old, that old ARM processor can't handle things, and you could more easily tie into an app ecosystem, which could extend the use of in-car entertainment. So I think what people aren't thinking about with something like iOS in the car, we don't even know where it could go. I think a lot of people think this will be kind of a licensed software play. We don't know that for sure. And even if it is, I think the ability to be able to extend smartphones into a car, you know, you look at high traction maybe in the US market, well, that's a market where Apple's doing its best, and it makes a lot of sense for these car companies to go along. But I want to kick this off to the next idea we're looking at, which is actually Nissan, saying that they want to have a driverless car by 2020. And I think that raises an interesting question. We talked about maybe moving entertainment off to companies like Apple. Should car companies be developing something like a driverless car when Google has its own, long development history of this? I believe their driverless cars are collecting some like a gigabyte of data per second, so wildly advanced stuff. What's the core competency here for car companies?
Well, it's interesting, Eric, because obviously Google's been playing around with driverless cars since 2010. You know, they've tested it out in the Toyota Prius. They've done a lot of testing. They're not a car producing company, though. Nissan obviously has got the Leaf. They've got some other cars as well. I think that this is a story that is going to gain traction in the next couple of years. I think driverless cars is going to pick up. You know, when Nissan comes out and says they're going to release one by 2020, I think this is the next evolution. It's kind of an interesting time to be in the automobile sector right now. You know, first there was the hybrids, then you had electric vehicles. Now we're talking about driverless cars. So there's a lot of technology and a lot of innovation going on. I think this is the next progression for those guys.
Yeah, and but that raises an interesting question. We could be in a golden era of innovation in cars right now, with Tesla coming out and already, what, a $20 billion company or something wild like that, which, as a Rule Breakers analyst, you are very happy with.
Very nice.
But, should car companies, something like electrical engines, should they be staying in that arena rather than driverless cars? Is this veering too much into Google's territory? Where'd you draw that line if you're running Ford or GM or Nissan?
Interestingly, I think that it all comes back to the consumer. For me, this is another step to improve consumer safety, which causes less collisions every year. Think about how much money you could save if you didn't have to worry about your car wrecking every couple of years or somebody else hitting into you. At the end of the day, it's going to be the consumer that's going to vote on this. I think for a car manufacturer, that's what they're actually looking at. It's a consumer safety play.
All right, and let's finish up with Apple, but not Apple itself, the suppliers around Apple. And we're suddenly seeing a march of the Apple suppliers. This week, Cirrus Logic jumped 15% a couple days, thanks in part to Avago, another Apple supplier seeing its own gains. And suddenly I'm seeing news about Qualcomm, Broadcom, and the Apple Play talk is back on the table, especially now that we've got an event coming up in a few days. So what are your thoughts on the Apple supplier plays in light of the new iPhone in just about a week?
This has actually become a cycle of itself almost. Apple announced an event, everybody looks to suppliers, which I don't quite know how that's going to come to fruition or not. But in this space, long-term play, I like Qualcomm. In their regional 3G, 4G estimates, this is the first year in which emerging markets are going to overtake developing markets in terms of units shipped. So I think Qualcomm has a long runway here. I think they're a good play. And regardless of how the rumors shake out, I think it's a good time to get into the company.
Simon, any thoughts on the run of the Apple suppliers?
Good point, but boom or bust with these hardware companies. A lot of them are selling pretty cheap right now, Eric, but again, good times or bad times, depending on whether or not you get in there.
Yeah, and let's look at cheapness. Qualcomm at 17.8 PE, Cirrus Logic at 10, Avago at 18, Broadcom, always an expensive company, but they just had a vicious haircut. I believe they were down about 30% after earnings. One thing I would say, I think a lot of people, let's focus on Cirrus Logic. Sure. A lot of people have sold them off because they've had margin compression. The fear is becoming a commodity player in semiconductors. They were going to move margins from about 50, a little bit above 50% down to 45%. One thing that they didn't say in that was a long-term guidance estimate. One thing they didn't say was the kind of volumes that would be commensurate with it. So I think what people are maybe looking at now, especially with Avago's guidance, is the iPhone 5C driving volumes that even with some lessened margins, you might be made well more than whole, and people are kind of realizing that. As far as your point on Qualcomm, one thing I love about Qualcomm is it's a semiconductor company that's not a semiconductor company.
Agreed.
You know, and you talk about 3G, 4G, baseband shipments. You're also deep in processors with Qualcomm. That will be a space that's going to be pressured deeply by emerging markets. We've got companies in China making quad-core processors for $8 each. You want to go to America, you're going to be up in that $20 range. So that's going to have some long-term pressures, and on the baseband side, we'll also see that. However, the bulk of their money is still in licensing, and as you said, there's still a big play around maybe the high-end smartphone markets drying up. Growth rates are coming down, but we're still seeing more traction in connected devices, not only in low-end smartphones, but also tablets, even computing devices of all kinds. So I think Qualcomm trading for less than market multiples is a good deal. And that's one company I just kind of keep as a kind of steadfast, kind of just in the portfolio, not going to be too flashy, but definitely future-proofed against a lot of trends as well. So anyways, that's it for this segment. And for all your tech news, make sure to check back into Fool.com. Fool on.